Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a podcast, then Podcaster's Paradise is an invaluable resource for you. With step-by-step video tutorials, a tremendous number of resources and templates, and daily support, Podcaster's Paradise is by far the most important resource for any aspiring podcaster. Plus, if you join Podcaster's Paradise through my link, then I will promote your podcast on the show. Check out Podcaster's Paradise at placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today I'm speaking with Rachel Helvering about the life and legacy of President James K. Polk. Rachel is the executive director of the President James K. Polk Home and Museum. You can follow the President James K. Polk Home and Museum at jameskpolk.com and on Facebook and Instagram under President James K. Polk. For more information, please check out the show notes page for this episode at placesandprofiles.com/18. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me. So before we go over the life and legacy of President Polk, let's just start with your background and connection to President Polk. So how did you come to be involved with telling the story of President Polk's life, and why do you in particular have an interest in President Polk?
Oh, it's a great question. I have lived in Tennessee my whole life. I always thought I would move away. And ended up going to school here. And then before I came to the Polk home, I worked at the Tennessee State Museum, where we obviously deal a lot with Tennessee presidents, Polk included. So I had an affinity for Polk before I ever started here. And when the job opening kind of came up, I've been here for 2 years. I was thrilled to get the chance to work at a presidential site. It is a complex history that we tell. The way we've talked about presidents historically has changed even in the last 10 years of, making sure we tell the whole story of American history. So it's an exciting time, I think, to be working at a presidential site and sharing that information. I just love it. I'm actually from Murfreesboro, which is where Sarah Polk is from. So I say that that's my connection. I married into the Polk family.
Well, that's fantastic that you have this connection and interest. So let's dive right in on talking about President Polk. And let's go to the early part of his life first. So what can you tell us about his early life, his family background? What was his upbringing life? And how does he find his way initially into politics?
Yeah, that's a good question. So he's born in North Carolina in 1795. Both of his grandfathers have fought in the Revolutionary War, which I think you can really see the influence of kind of that founding father era. James K. Polk is in this weird in between. He's not quite in the Civil War. He's not Lincoln. He's kind of in between, but you can see the influence of kind of the founding fathers and the beginning of America on his life. And I think it comes partially from those two grandfathers. His mother, Jane, is a staunch Presbyterian. I think that will really shape his life. She's very into discipline and, doing the right thing. She has a lot of religious tones that she brings to his life that he's not necessarily a very religious man, but you can see how that shapes him. His father, Samuel, is a land surveyor and will eventually bring his family west to Columbia, Tennessee. They'll kind of move here in a wagon to the frontier. And I think all of that shapes him deeply, and especially shapes his presidency when you see how keen he is on westward expansion, because he's seen that play out in his own family and his own life. And he's seen what it's done for them, which is build wealth and land and profit. And his family has grown to be quite large in Columbia. So he sees westward expansion as this kind of great, I think, adventure and a way to really make something of yourself. That's 3 very quick snapshots of things that kind of influence his life. But I think it's clear that he's smart at a young age, but he's ill. He makes this journey to Columbia, and it takes its toll. And eventually, when he's about 17, he'll have to have surgery. He goes up to Kentucky with his dad, and it's what at the time they call bladder stones. no anesthesia. You can imagine how horrific a surgery that is. And we think that probably makes him sterile because he certainly never has children. But you can see how all of that really shapes him. And when his health kind of has a moderate uptick after this surgery, he's able to go to college, and he goes to the University of North Carolina. And you can see that he's eager to learn. I think you can see his intellect throughout those early years and kind of his eagerness to be involved in things high up that are happening in Tennessee. So all of that kind of sets him up for having a life in politics. I don't think that he's necessarily a natural politician. He's a really hard worker, and he's very good at getting stuff done. And he's very streamlined in his thinking. I think he's able to really figure out here are key objectives that I want to tackle. But the actual kind of politicking side of it is not his strong suit. And so you can see his political career really gets going when he marries Sarah. And Sarah is very good at the politicking, and she complements him well in kind of reaching the highest office.
Yeah, can you provide a little more detail on how Sarah complements him and just how she is so good at the politicking and how she is able to help along future President Polk's political career?
Yeah, so Sarah is, her maiden name is Childress. And as I mentioned, she's from Murfreesboro, and is provided, she and her sister both are provided an unbelievable education for women at the time. So she's very on par. I think her intellect is probably very close to James, but she also gets this great education. She eventually will be sent to the Moravian Girls' School, which is like a finishing school, and she gets tutored before that. So she matches him in the sense that she's well educated, and I think she's very driven. And I think the key piece for James, he's not terribly trusting of people. He very much wants to be in control of when he's president. He's a micromanager. You know, he kind of never lets somebody else take the reins of anything, but he does with Sarah. And you can see that he really trusts her opinion and judgment. And so Sarah's able to turn the role of First Lady into kind of what it is today in a lot of ways. And she's able to really discreetly be engaged in politics. So she's not outright doing anything overtly political, but because she's very smart and very aware of what the issues are, she's able to use every dinner party and gathering to the best advantage of Polk's kind of presidential platform. And before that, when he's in Congress and when he's in the governor's office here in Tennessee, she's going through all of that with him. She will help run his campaigns, especially when he's running for governor of Tennessee a couple different times. You can see the letters between them that she's very involved behind the scenes. But Sarah's smart enough to realize and kind of, I think, use her femininity to help her out. You know, she's writing to all sorts of men, which is something that could be very scandalous at the time. She's keeping correspondence up with all these different men, but she just does it so well. I think she knows how to act as a woman at that time without causing a scandal, but also in a way that gives her great power in the White House and before.
Well, and I definitely want to talk about Sarah more later in this conversation. But before we get there, let's kind of talk about the trajectory of Polk's career. But because before he runs for president, before he becomes president, he's Speaker of the House, he's governor of Tennessee. So how does he come to hold those two fairly prominent roles as Speaker of the House and as governor of Tennessee? And what are some of his key experiences that shape him during his time holding those particular roles?
Yeah, absolutely. When he comes back from the University of North Carolina, when he graduates from college, he has a degree in math. I mean, it's not a clear trajectory into politics, but when he comes home, he apprentices to be a lawyer. And he does that with a man named Felix Grundy. And Felix Grundy is a really prominent lawyer and man in Nashville, and he'll serve in quite a few other offices. So Felix Grundy is a huge piece of kind of Polk's development. Polk will start his own law practice in Tennessee and start getting experience that way. And it's around this time that he'll meet Sarah. Some people think that Sarah helps kind of push him into politics, whether that's true or not. As he's kind of becoming a lawyer and being influenced and guided by Felix Grundy, he will become a Senate clerk for the Tennessee House of Representatives, the Tennessee State Senate, which is located in Murfreesboro at the time. So that's the first role he gets and kind of dips his toes into politics. And he'll eventually go on to be in the U.S. House of Representatives, but he's in the Tennessee House of Representatives first. So you can see how he kind of baby steps his way up. But very quickly, he jumps up to be serving in the United States House of Representatives. And a lot of that is due to his second mentor, which is Andrew Jackson, who's going to be a huge believer in Polk, and Polk believes in him. He's fully bought in on the kind of Jacksonian ideas about American policy, and he's a huge supporter of Jackson. But I think with Jackson's influence, he's getting married. He goes into the House of Representatives. You can see how things in his life are kind of lining up to help him reach that goal. He'll serve in the House of Representatives a couple of times, and then eventually he will become Speaker. So that's, a real overall look at kind of things that how his political trajectory plays out. But I do think you can't kind of undersell how invested Polk is in Jackson's kind of prowess. And his first speech he gives in the House of Representatives, the United States House of Representatives, is a speech fully in support of Andrew Jackson. So from the very first time he's kind of in Congress, he's there to show his support for Andrew Jackson. And he'll hold to that when Jackson's fighting bank wars and various things. Jackson is his kind of man in Congress.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about his connection to Andrew Jackson and how Andrew Jackson in some ways served as a mentor to Polk, and exactly what this meant in the context of the Democratic Party at the time and some of the divisions and groups that were kind of being tapped into by Polk by having this relationship with Jackson?
Sure. I think, again, there's a lot of things you can talk about comparing Polk and Jackson. And one thing is that Polk, his personality is not something that overwhelms you, and it's not something that people remember terribly well. Polk's own cabinet will call him tedious when he's president. So it's just, he doesn't have that larger than life persona that Jackson has. And Jackson has established himself as that. He'll be president during the time that Polk is coming into the United States Congress. So you can see, and I don't want to say it's riding on Jackson's coattails, but you can certainly see where Jackson's influence, where it's kind of peaking at this point that Polk is coming into politics, will really benefit Polk. But at the same time, as I mentioned, Jackson's not without his controversies, and something like his bank wars, where he's trying to shut down the U.S. bank. Polk will fully support him in that. And I think I don't ever want to undersell Polk, because I don't think that he's just, this man has mentored me and I'm going to just lock, stock, and barrel, I'm with him. But I really think that the things that Jackson is trying to achieve are things that Polk really believes in. I think a lot of that is that their upbringing on the frontier is very similar. They're both kind of products of the Tennessee frontier, even though Jackson's a little bit older than Polk. And I think stuff like westward expansion and feeling like the rich, entitled elite people have something over the poor frontiersmen is something that Polk can really relate to. And of course, that's what Jackson will kind of ride into the White House on. So I don't know that I answered your question, because I just went in a big circle, but I do think I always want to make the point that I don't think that Polk is just like a lemming. He's not just following Jackson blindly because he really likes Jackson or they're friends or he's a mentor. But you can really see that he really does believe in what Jackson is trying to do.
Absolutely. So Polk, as we mentioned earlier, he was Speaker of the House, and that makes him the only Speaker of the House to this point to ever be elected president. But before he's elected president and after he's Speaker of the House, he goes back to Tennessee and he becomes governor. So what does this transition and what does that time in his life look like when he's governor of Tennessee? Yeah,
that's a great segue, actually, because he really loves being in Washington. Sarah will go with him almost every single congressional session. Sarah's there with him. She's already kind of dipping her toes into Washington politics and life. And essentially, he seems very happy as Speaker of the House. But the reason he'll come back to Tennessee is to shore up support for the Democratic Party, because the Whigs in Tennessee are gaining a lot of momentum. Jackson will ask Polk to come back and run for governor. And you get the sense that he really doesn't want to, that he's really happy with his role in Washington. But for the good of the party, and again, because of his belief in Jackson, he does that. And he comes back and runs for governor. And his first run is successful. And he'll serve 2 years as governor, and then he gets defeated. And that's, I think, really politically the darkest, and maybe personally, the darkest point of Polk's life, because he's defeated by a Tennessee politician named, his nickname is Lean Jimmy, who's known for really great stump speeches, and he's funny, and he's very vivacious. He's essentially everything. He's tall. He's everything that Polk is not. But Polk takes everything so seriously, and he takes his role and his job really seriously. And so you can see how demoralizing that is for him, that he's beaten twice by Lean Jimmy. And that's when he really thinks his political career is over. And he's obviously not he does win that first election as governor, but he's not super well loved. He doesn't have that ability to kind of connect with people, I think. So he'll run twice. He'll be defeated both times. He's living here in Columbia, and he's just kind of, I don't want to say washed up, but he certainly feels that way.
So how does he recover from this defeat, and how does he make this pivot to what in many ways is a very unlikely presidential campaign in 1844?
Absolutely. He really doesn't do it. I mean, not that he doesn't have political ambition anymore or anything like that, but it's friends of his that really start kind of putting his name in the hat for the Democratic nomination. One in particular, Gideon Pillow, who's also from Columbia and will eventually serve in the Mexican-American War under Polk, is at the Democratic convention. And he is one of the biggest ones trying to get Polk's name thrown in. And basically, the Democratic Party is fracturing for a few reasons. They don't have a front-runner candidate. Martin Van Buren is another of Jackson's kind of proteges, and he's already had one term as president, and he goes into it thinking that he's going to get this nomination. But Lewis Cass, who also has served with Jackson, is climbing up. And so eventually Martin Van Buren kind of realizes he's not going to get the nomination, and he throws his weight behind Polk. So you can see some of Jackson's influence there, but not as overtly. He doesn't come in and say, hey, here's my pick for president. You guys all nominate him. You can see where Polk's other friends kind of come in and get his name in the hat. And again, I think they really believe in him. Another Tennessean that's helping with this is Cave Johnson. He'll go on to be the postmaster general in Polk's cabinet. So they're writing to Polk here in Columbia saying like, oh, we're getting you the nomination, essentially. And that's maybe the bigger, I don't know, you can play it two ways of that's a big coup for Polk that he's even the Democratic candidate. And then it's also surprising that he wins the election of 1844. So it's kind of a twofold dark horse triumph.
Yeah, and he is very much associated with that dark horse label. So can you walk us through a little more? Because you said it was this twofold triumph where both parts are shocking, not just being the Democratic nominee over someone like Van Buren, as you mentioned, but also defeating Henry Clay in the general election, who, of course, had tried multiple times to become president by that point, and himself had been speaker, a very influential senator from Kentucky. So how was Polk able to complete the entirety of this process, the nomination and the general, and actually get elected president?
Yeah, so I think in the primary, I think that's where, to me, that's maybe more surprising, because I think by the time, and it certainly isn't obvious to everybody in 1844, but I think by the time Polk is a general candidate the American people can vote on, he has a really strong platform. And he basically says he's going to tackle these huge problems that Americans have been facing, or that have been kind of a discussion in politics in America for a while. And so when he runs, he promises these 4 goals. And he's our only president who kind of lives up to his word. He completes all his goals in office, not to jump ahead. But I think that's strong. The biggest issue that a lot of people, especially in the Southwest at that time, would have been the Southwest at that time, I want to know about the annexation of Texas. And though he does not annex it, John Tyler will do that right before. But Polk is super pro Texas annexation. And that's part of why he gets the Democratic nomination. And that's part of why he will win against Henry Clay, because that has been this huge ongoing issue, right? So Davy Crockett has already fought at the Alamo. This has been ongoing. We have tons of Tennesseans who are settling in Texas. And there's a big question of what to do with that. So in a lot of people, in a lot of the public's minds at the time, that is kind of the question to answer. And Polk has such a strong stance on it, and he follows through. I mean, very effectively follows through, at least for anybody who wanted to really annex Texas. He does it very well. But I think he comes out with such a strong platform that he's able to win the American public. It is not a landslide, right? He doesn't win by a landslide. It's like 40,000 votes. But he really asserts himself during that campaign. And, Henry Clay's campaign slogan is, or not slogan, but the thing they use to kind of bring Polk down is they say, who's James K. Polk? Like, nobody knows who he is, even though he's been Speaker of the House and governor of Tennessee. He's clearly been around in politics for a while. They try to kind of tear Polk down. And I think the opposite could be said for Clay, he's been around for such a long time, trying to throw his hat in the ring and failing, that I think in a lot of ways, Polk is a fresh face and a strong stance can kind of win the presidency. And of course, Polk promises he'll only serve one term, which is a huge deal in both the primary and the main election of, like, if you don't love me, it's only 4 years and I won't run again. And I think all of that just really seals the deal. I argue all the time that I would vote for a candidate who had such a strong platform as Polk, even though the issues are different. I think somebody who is willing to say, like, I really am going to fix this stuff and I'm going to do it in 4 years is a good goal.
Yeah, and he stuck by that promise. We've seen all sorts of politicians in recent decades promise they're only going to serve X number of terms in Congress or in the Senate or as president, and sometimes they follow through on that and sometimes they don't. So the fact that he stood by that, that definitely says something. But since you mentioned the annexation of Texas in there, and you touched on some of the connections between Tennessee and Texas with Davy Crockett, former congressman from Tennessee, fighting and dying at the Alamo. Sam Houston was one of James K. Polk's predecessors as governor of Tennessee. Yeah. He's later going to lead the Texas troops during the Texas Revolution, be president of the Republic of Texas, and later governor of Texas. So there are a lot of connections there, and it would make sense for Polk to have this interest, I guess we could say, in Texas. But Polk's presidency really had an effect on shaping American boundaries, not just with Texas, but with Oregon, and then with the Mexican Cession and all the land that the U.S. gained during the Mexican-American War. So I guess those are kind of the three main places where boundary disputes and boundary changes occurred, with Texas, with Oregon, and out west with the Mexican Cession. Can you talk a little bit about the 4 years that Polk served as presidency and just how we saw the boundaries of the U.S. change during that time and what that meant?
Absolutely. So one of his other 4 goals is, of course, to settle our northern border in Oregon with Great Britain. And one of his campaign slogans, or one that people will use for his campaign, is 4440 or fight. And this is actually a time that I think positively reflects on Polk, because he does reach an agreement. I think there's a point that we could have gone to war with Great Britain again too, but Polk is willing to negotiate. And so we kind of peacefully negotiate the northern border. But again, that's something that's been, this is not a new issue in America over, like, where's our northern border, but Polk decisively does handle it. So I think that's a huge deal. And of course, that brings in a ton of the Pacific Northwest officially into the United States. And then in the Mexican-American War, he will eventually gain, most of the Southwest. So we bring in over 100,000, 300,000. I just went blank on the square miles, but it's a ton of land. It's a third of the United States comes in in the end of Polk's presidency, which is more than any other president and will completely, I think, shape the coming decades. The biggest thing that you see Polk not dealing with in his own lifetime and kind of setting America up for is the issue of slavery. Of course, he and Henry Clay are both slave owners. They even kind of throw mud during their campaigns of like, I'm the better slave owner than the other one. And then Polk absolutely knows as he's expanding that slavery is just this huge issue. So he thinks he can kind of balance it. If they bring Oregon in as a free state and Texas in as a slave state, we can kind of keep this balance. But obviously we expand so rapidly and there's so much territory added. That is eventually what we're going to see kind of descend us into civil war. So if I was going to put out one glaring omission that Polk doesn't handle, it's slavery, and neither do any of the other politicians of that time. But you can see it really setting up for the potential civil war.
Yeah, can you talk a little more about Polk and slavery, both how he approached it as a politician and then personally, what sorts of connections he had to slavery?
Yeah, so personally, his family gains a lot of land. His grandfather and his father are land surveyors, and they're moving west. By the time his father dies, he has about 50 enslaved people, which is a pretty good number. And Polk personally seems to be against it. He has in his will that his enslaved people will be freed after he and Sarah both die, and that never happens because Sarah lives through emancipation. So his will kind of never does that. But you can see that he's personally conflicted by it, but he's very dependent on it, which I think can be said of a lot of white men at this time, that they kind of see the horrors of it, but they can't quite figure out how to make money besides that. And Polk is not wealthy himself. He does have some land. He's got a law practice, but he's not wealthy. He's trying very hard to build wealth. So he will purchase a plantation in West Tennessee and then eventually one in Mississippi. And he'll be this absentee plantation owner. So we actually have a decent look of kind of what's happening on his plantations, because all of the work decisions being made basically are coming in letters from his overseer. And that will be through his time in the White House. And he'll be trading enslaved people while in the White House through middlemen. He uses brother-in-laws and business associates who will purchase enslaved people in their names and then transfer them to James's name. And he does that because he's very keenly aware that on the national political level, slavery is a huge issue, right? It's a huge hot button issue. There's plenty of opposition to it, even at this time. And so he tries really hard to keep a little bit of a distance between himself and the enslaved people that he owns. But again, he dies quickly after leaving the White House. He doesn't have time to edit any papers. We have a lot of the letters and things about kind of how he's running his plantations.
If you're an aspiring podcaster, then joining Podcasters Paradise is an absolute must. Podcasters Paradise is a premium membership community that will help you create, grow, and monetize your podcast. With step-by-step video tutorials, resources, and templates, and daily support via the private Facebook group, Podcasters Paradise is the best place to learn how to be a successful podcaster. Joining Podcasters Paradise has helped me with my podcast in so many ways. It is truly a tremendous resource. Plus, as an added bonus, if you join Podcasters Paradise through my link, then after you launch your podcast, I will mention on my show and link to your podcast from placesandprofiles.com, as long as your podcast is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Podcasters Paradise and get started on your podcasting journey today by going to placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/paradise. All right, so going back to the Polk White House, you obviously touched on some of the things that were part of his agenda, some of the things that he said he was going to do, and we also talked about how boundary disputes and changes in the borders of the U.S. Shaped his White House. But can you provide some additional information and characteristics of Polk's presidency and some of the other things that someone listening to this should know about those 4 years that he spent in the White House?
Absolutely. He, in my opinion, and some historians would agree, he's just tremendously prepared to be president. He has served in all three branches of governments. If we go back to our civics lessons, he's been a lawyer in the judicial branch. He's been in the legislative branch. He's been a governor in the executive branch. So he comes in with a lot of knowledge, I think, about how all these pieces work. If not at the federal level, then he quickly learns. And he says right before he goes to Washington, he says, I'm going to be the president. Like, I'm going to really do this if I'm going to do this. So I mentioned earlier, too, he's called tedious because he is a micromanager and he is really keeping an eye on everything that's going on. So I think all of that probably very much colors his time in the White House. We know he's working just extremely long days. He ages rapidly. We've got portraits that are about 3.5 years apart, and he looks like he's aged. His hair is completely white. So he's just working tremendously. And again, he isn't maybe great at that personal aspect of politics, but he's very committed to those promises he made the American people. So he's working a ton. He's really keeping an eye on everything, running a very tight ship, and in a lot of ways only dependent on Sarah for true kind of guidance. She will help look at letters he's received and figure out which ones he needs to see. She'll look at the newspaper and flag things that she thinks he needs to read. A lot of the information that he gets will kind of come through Sarah. So again, you see her having just unbelievable power, but she does it all in a way that's really socially acceptable at the time. So that's maybe the kind of inside angle of the how the White House is working under the Polks. But he will also be tackling some economic issues like lowering tariffs and establishing an independent treasury. Those are two of his other goals. And they're not completely uncontroversial, but he does achieve both of those. He, in a lot of ways, kind of bullies Congress to get him through. And again, Sarah's very good at helping him do some of that politicking. So she will host these elaborate dinners and have congressmen come, and they're long dinners. They're like 4 hours long, some of them. And she's there kind of helping get these bills passed through and get stuff done. Especially in the South, like Tennessee, lowering tariffs is a huge deal. And it's a very popular thing because it's going to save money, right? It's going to make the product that people are buying cheaper. And then establishing an independent treasury is kind of his response and the Democratic Party's response to the U.S. banks. So we know that Jackson will fight this big war against banks. And eventually this is kind of how they decide to solve that. So again, issues that have been going on for some time that Polk says he's going to tackle and does. So one other thing that's going to happen is they're going to oversee some renovations of the White House, and Sarah will oversee that. She comes in under budget. She's very thrifty, and the American public loves that. So while they're there, they're still very careful with money and very fiscally sound. And I think that reflects well on them.
Yeah, and you've obviously talked about Sarah quite a bit here, but I want to go back to something that you said about her earlier in our conversation, when you said that she really kind of transformed the position of First Lady and made it into what it is today. You've obviously talked quite a bit already about what her role looked like in her husband's White House, in the Polk White House. But can you talk a little bit more about just how unusual and how different this was, and just how drastic of a change she made to this position of First Lady? Yes. And I don't want to overestimate her importance, though we do. Obviously, we love the Polks and we like to puff them up a little from their museum here. But I think in a lot of ways, she just kind of helps establish maybe things that other First Ladies have done. They just haven't been as traditional as we see today, right? We're still very early. This is the 11th First Lady. We're still so early in American history and that legacy. But some of the things she does, like she has the band play Hail to the Chief every time Polk comes into something. And that's been done before, but it hasn't been done every time. And she said, oh, he's the president. People need to know when he's arriving. We're going to have the band play Hail to the Chief every time. So that's one thing we date back to her time as First Lady. And we'll see that continue on. And she's the First Lady that has this role kind of political aspiration or political interest. And, we see First Ladies today taking on causes, and they have platforms and they have their own agenda. And while Sarah is still very much in support of her husband,
she certainly is bringing that kind of political aspect of her work. And when she's hosting parties, she's not just having, a ball or a dance or something. She has some real intent behind it to achieve something. So I think those are some of the big things we can see come out of her time as First Lady. And I will say, she's from Murfreesboro. She's from the frontier. No one really expects her to be very finished or refined. They think kind of, oh, we've got this like country bumpkin coming in to be the First Lady. And she's so refined, and she's a wonderful hostess. And even people who really don't like James report how much they love Sarah. She just is kind of very together. She does get the nickname Sahara Sarah because she bans hard liquor and dancing. So that when they go to his inaugural balls, they don't dance. She's also a very staunch Presbyterian. So even with that kind of nickname of Sahara Sarah, she's still very loved, and really just establishes herself as a Washington, D.C. figure. Again, the things that you would think of for a First Lady today.
Yeah, so let's shift back to some characteristics and aspects of Polk's presidency. And one thing that we really haven't touched on, we've talked about U.S. foreign policy during this period from the standpoint of border disputes and annexing new territory, but we haven't really discussed it from the standpoint of the U.S.'s stature globally. And this is going to be a theme throughout much of the 1800s into the 1900s, is that the U.S. is not only finding its footing as a country, but it's kind of emerging and establishing itself as a global player. Now, at this point in the 1840s, we're still decades away from the U.S. being a global power. But how does the U.S.'s stature on a global stage and the way that people are viewing the U.S. from abroad, how does that change, if at all, during Polk's 4 years in the White House?
Yeah, I think one thing that he changes, he'll establish some consulates. We actually have a gift in our collection. It's a marble eagle that Polk turned into a table. That was a gift from the consulate of Tunisia. So he'll be establishing some consulates. I mean, this is not foreign policy related, but huge strides will be made during Polk's presidency, like the founding of the Smithsonian Institution, the founding of Annapolis. They laid the cornerstone for the Washington Monument. Just this is a real peak time. There's a lot happening. It's not all reflective of, I think, Polk himself, but I think the cultural kind of prowess of the country is growing. And I'm always impressed because Polk really doesn't travel much. He goes to Kentucky for surgery. He goes to Washington, D.C. He's not going on any big trips abroad. He's not going to Paris or anything like that. But he does have a really, I think, global mindset of how America should be reaching other countries. And so one thing he does is establish some consulates around the world to start kind of building up that foreign policy.
So before we turn to the last little bit of Polk's life, let's just kind of, I guess, sum up his presidency in the sense of how is this generally viewed by historians? It seems like the presidents between Jackson and Lincoln are largely forgotten, but Polk seems to be the one that has kind of emerged as still being a figure that historians will rank pretty highly during that stretch of time. How do historians in general view Polk's presidency, and how might they compare him to some other presidents?
That's a great question. And I think, it'll differ from historian to historian, but I think in general, he's viewed as like the one really strong president, as you mentioned, between Jackson and Lincoln. He's a very strong president. He is generally well ranked, but obviously, especially as we move into more full narratives about the history of the time, a lot of the things he's doing are highly controversial and are controversial today. Like he puts forth the gag rule in Congress as speaker that keeps you from speaking about slavery. He will fully support Jackson's Cherokee Indian removal and the Trail of Tears. His kind of willingness to pick a fight with Mexico. in all public facing ways, he does try diplomacy with Mexico first, but he doesn't really. You can tell he's kind of like, it looks like we're at war with Mexico. There's not a ton of diplomacy involved there. So I do think, and again, as we move into a more full scholarship of what all goes into American history at this time, there's the good and the bad, right? And that's our job. It's to tell the full legacy of Polk. He's a person and he makes mistakes, and maybe some of his calls are bad. But I don't think he has a perfect 100 by any historian. No historian's like the perfect president, because obviously everything a president or anybody does in history is nuanced. But yes, he does get a fairly high ranking from historians in general, and is seen as being a very effective president. And obviously, we've just talked about how much he accomplishes.
So we get to the end of his presidency, March 4th, 1849, and 3 months later, he's dead, and his wife, Sarah, goes on to live another 42 years up until 1891. So why does Polk die so quickly after leaving the White House? What sorts of goals might he have had for this period of life that he never got to? And then what goes on to happen to Sarah during these 42 years that she's still alive after her husband has passed away?
Those are great questions. I think his only goal for this period of his life is to rest. Like, he is fully exhausted when he leaves the White House, and he's writing in letters. Everything that they're doing is just kind of to get him to where he can rest. He takes less vacation days than any other president while he's in office. So again, he's this real micromanager, keeps his promise, but at a great cost. His health is never great either. We talked about his health as a child. You can see it in letters that Sarah's writing him when he's running for governor. She's always checking to see how his health is. So I think he's always kind of struggling with health, and obviously isn't sleeping enough. And all this to say, he does a brief tour on his way home from Washington, D.C., comes to Columbia. He visits various places for a couple weeks, and then goes to their retirement home in Nashville, which was called Polk Place. They'd bought it from Felix Grundy, his mentor that I mentioned. They bought this house. Sarah had been overseeing the refurbishment of it. They'd just kind of gotten it to where they wanted it. And he was very excited to go and be resting at his home in Nashville. But either in Columbia or Nashville, he contracts cholera and dies pretty quickly from that, as you can tell, from just being out of the White House a few months. So I don't think he had a ton of goals for this time, except he knew he was exhausted. So in a lot of ways, I think it's not surprising that he does die so quickly. And Sarah will live on for 42 years, and she lives in Polk Place for the rest of her life. It's just a few blocks away from the Tennessee state capitol. She maintains this very well-loved status in America and in Tennessee. And you can see that especially during the Civil War. She'll be in her home in Nashville, which is a Confederate capital, but it's the first one to fall, very divided. And she maintains neutrality through all of that, even though she has tons of relatives who fight for the Confederacy. She always thinks that James would have been pro-Union. She really thinks that James would have believed in keeping the Union together. And so she supports that. She'll host Confederate generals and Union generals at her home in Nashville. She takes in the Tennessee Historical Society. It's one of the oldest collections of artifacts in the state, and she keeps that in her living room to keep it safe, because as the Union Army approaches, everybody's worried they're going to loot or burn or whatever. And so she will take quite a few belongings of neighbors and the Tennessee Historical Collection to keep it safe in her home. She knows that as a first lady, the Union soldiers won't do anything to her house, and she's right. So she really does have an amazing life. She also will be a plantation owner. She's one of just a few women in Tennessee at that time. When James dies, she inherits the land. She will continue to run his plantation. That is her only means of survival. There's no pension for widows or former first ladies. And by all accounts, she's a very harsh mistress. You can see that she feels very dependent on that. She'll even be selling cotton during Union occupation, during the Civil War. She'll write to Andrew Johnson, who's the military governor, and say, basically, I'm a poor widowed first lady. You've got to help me out. And so she's one of the only Southerners who owns a plantation that's able to sell their cotton during this kind of blockade by the Union. So unbelievably remarkable life. when she gets a little older after the Civil War, she essentially does not leave her home anymore. James K. Polk is buried on the front lawn, and she really devotes herself to continuing his legacy. And she will have people in, kind of, you could come up from the street and she'd probably let you come in and see some of his presidential memorabilia. And her great niece and that great niece's daughter, their names are Sally and Sadie. They'll go on to form the association that still runs our museum today. So we have all the stuff here directly from Sarah and Sadie and Sally. They're the ones that kind of commit themselves to remembering James's legacy, because I think he does die so soon and gets eclipsed by the history of the Civil War, and they can see that public memory about him and his presidency is fading.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad that we've had this chance today to try to revive some of that memory and some of the key characteristics of his legacy. Before we wrap up, is there anything about President Polk or about Sarah Polk that we haven't gotten to that you feel like is important for someone learning about them to understand about who they were and why they're significant?
That's a great question. I really don't think we have. I hopefully have given enough information to at least give you a little bit of color of kind of what they were like. And I think they're both extraordinary. We love telling the story of them, the good and the bad and the ugly, because it's an amazing part of American history that I think has been kind of lost in between Mexican-American War and Civil War and all these other big events. It really helps figure out how we are formed as a nation today.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for joining me and being so generous with your time. If someone wants to learn more about your work or about the work being done at the President James K. Polk Home and Museum, or more about the Home and Museum in general, or more about Polk in general, where would you direct them? Where would you recommend they go and take a look?
Yeah, our website is www.jameskpolk.com. And we have lots of information and resources. You can reach out if you want some good book recommendations. We can provide all of that. And I should mention, there is one other James K. Polk site, and it's a state park in North Carolina where his birthplace home would have been. They've rebuilt, I think, a cabin. We're the only house that Polk lived in that's still standing. But there are some other great sites out there telling the story of Polk, too.
All right. Well, and I hate to say it, but I have not been to the Polk home where you work. I have been, though, to the birthplace location in North Carolina. I was in Charlotte a few months ago and went and checked that out. So I have been to that one. Hopefully I'll get to the Polk home at some point soon. For other people who are interested in going, again, the website for that is jameskpolk.com. And of course, the place to find all sorts of resources and links and information related to today's episode is the show notes page at placesandprofiles.com/18. So placesandprofiles.com/18 is the place to go for this episode. And Rachel, thank you again for joining me today and for being so generous with your time to talk about the life and legacy of President James K. Polk, to talk about his wife, Sarah, and to revive and remember this period of American history that is often overlooked. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to talk about Polk.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.